The Dunwell Report, featuring top Montana newsmakers, discussing the issues that affect the Treasure State. From Montana State Capitol, here is your moderator, Don Dunwell.
Shortly after the Second World War, the U.S. reported a flurry of aerial phenomena that came to be described as flying saucers. Later, government investigators and others called them unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Now, despite the frequency of the sightings, the U.S. Air Force, which was charged with investigating the reports, along with some other scientists, tended to dismiss the sightings as other aerial phenomena, such as weather balloons, birds, or aircraft reflections. But the persistence of some evidence, a Montana film in particular, has kept the issue alive. Joan Bird, who now lives in Helena, has written a book about the Montana UFOs and extraterrestrials. I'll get that word out, yeah, right. And this, you've got a copy of the book there, I've got a copy of the book that we've read, and this was published just last year.
Yes, about a year ago now, a little more.
Before we get into the book and some of the issues that are in it, let's talk about your background for a minute. You are not just someone who just walked in off the street or from the bus stop. You've been trained as a scientist, am I correct?
Yes, in fact, that's why I came to Montana in the first place, was to attend the University of Montana graduate school in zoology.
And you got a doctor's degree there, I believe?
That's right. I worked on inter-island variation in lesser Antillean bullfinches and was really steeped in evolutionary biology and scientific research.
And I think you come from a family of people who have a vested interest in science as a discipline.
Yes, my brother is a career astrophysicist and my father was an aeronautical engineer, so I have some of that in my heritage.
We'll get a little bit later on how what their thoughts or opinions might be about your study of ufology, as the field is, I believe it's called right now. Am I correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
All right.
Way to pronounce it.
What brought you? Well, let me start this question this way. Do you believe that unidentified flying objects exist, and do you believe that there's an extraterrestrial connection?
I do. I've become convinced in the hours that I've spent in reading the literature and primarily by witness accounts.
How about hard phenomena or hard evidence?
There is quite a bit out there. There's a fair amount of physical evidence. And again, if you look into the literature, you can find it. There are depressions in the ground where there have been landings. There are alterations of the soil that are unexplained. There are implants in people that, there's a man who had studied that phenomenon who just recently died, who was very well known, Dr. Roger Lear. And he was finding that these implants had nanotechnologies in them that we do not yet understand when he did microscopic analysis, and also that they had alloys in them that are not known from Earth at this time. So I think that there's significant physical evidence in addition to the hundreds of thousands of witness evidence reports.
So you trained, got your PhD in zoology with a specialty that you spent a number of years working in and researching. Mm-hmm. Were you ever a skeptic about UFOs?
I was convinced by the Condon report because I always thought it was an interesting subject. I mean, heavens, this is, the possibility of there being extraterrestrial life is just a very significant thing to know about. So when the Condon study took place at the University of Colorado back in the late 60s, I think I was a second-year college student, and I was interested. I was like, okay, let's get some scientists on this and let's figure this thing out. And when the reports came out about a year and a half later, and the headline said, "We are not being visited," I was like, oh darn, guess not. I had no idea what had gone on behind the scenes with the Condon report. It wasn't really until I did the research on this book that I got deep into all of the machinations and the really the things that happened with the Condon report that were really inexcusable and very unscientific. And there were a few scientists who saw it at the time who actually read the report and said, how could he come up with a conclusion like that when 23% of the reports that they investigated they were not able to identify?
All right, what we're going to do is take a break right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the reports that were brought out and also take a look at a snippet of film that sort of is the early Montana connection to this whole field.
Yes.
We'll be back with our guest, Joan Bird, after the break. Is Joan Bird, and she's the author of a book called Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials. And there's a very well-known in the field film that was taken by a man in Great Falls in 1950, I think was the year. What is that?
It's the Mariana UFO film, and it's still considered to be one of the best pieces of UFO evidence that has ever been submitted to the government for UFO investigations. And it survived every one of those investigations. They were never able to identify it.
Except
so it's
that,
famous.
As I understand it, that according to Mariana, they took about 35 frames from the beginning of the footage that he supplied to them. Is that
yes,
correct?
very interesting. And there was a document that was declassified in July of 2011 that talks about that.
Okay, we're going to take a look at the footage that does exist right now and a narrative track that goes along with it so we can see what we're talking about here. Okay. This is the Nick Mariana.
This is the Montana film, projected exactly as it was photographed. The objects are moving against a 25 to 28 mile an hour wind. This is the film in double frame or slow motion. A slight bounce in the movement of the objects as well as the tower is perceptible. This is due to the handheld camera. The film, analyzed frame by frame, shows the movement of the objects to be horizontal and steady.
We will now vary the action and size of the objects and also stop the action from time to time for your study. We have just made a jump cut in the film to an enlarged size and reversed the action. You are now seeing the objects exactly as they were photographed, but from a closer perspective.
And of course, the footage was looped over and over again
Yes.
and enlarged there.
Yes.
But you say that is one of the few existing actual captures, so to speak, of an unidentified or unidentified flying objects in this case.
Yes, that they haven't been able to identify. There are a few others, but it's getting harder and harder to have them not be photoshopped or so. The fact that it was 1950 is an important factor in its being unidentifiable. The final word was able to be decided upon because you have the grain elevator and the water tower in the foreground, so you can figure out the relative speed. You don't know the distance from the camera, so you can't figure out the absolute speed unless you know the distance from the camera. But the final conclusion that was actually published by an engineer in the Journal of Astronautics and Science in 1968 was it cannot be aircraft, because if they were aircraft, they had to have been close enough to the camera that you could tell that they were aircraft. The fact that they are so fuzzy and they're so indistinct means that they have to be far enough away from the camera that they were going too fast for the aircraft that were flying at the time.
Well, the initial Air Force reports that studied it dismissed it as aircraft reflections.
Right.
And
right.
then, but that was modified later, am I correct?
Yes, that was Project Grudge, and Project Grudge's assignment was to come up with some kind of explanation for everything that was out there. But when Ed Ruppelt was assigned to Project Blue Book, which was the next government investigation on UFOs, but from the Air Force, he went back and revisited it, and he looked at it, and he looked at the records, and he said it could not have been jet aircraft because we know what jet aircraft were flying at the time. And Mariana himself said that shortly after the UFOs disappeared, there were aircraft that came in from another area and landed at Maelstrom, although it was called something else then. But so it was disproven a number of times, and in the end, in the Condon report, the man who did the photographic analysis, who was well known for his capabilities in this field, says that jet aircraft just do not offer an adequate explanation for what we have here. So.
And weather balloons and birds don't either.
Oh yeah, no, all of that stuff was easily dismissed.
So, but there were, at that time, there were a number of sightings around the country, as I recall.
Yes, there was a tremendous amount of activity, and there was a lot of concern because they were getting so many reports, and the reality is that an awful lot of reports are identifiable, a huge percentage of them, because a lot of people just don't spend time looking at the sky. So they don't know what meteorites or Venus or what kind of aircraft are out there. So that's one of the problems, is that they were being flooded with so many citizen reports. And I think there were a lot of extraterrestrial craft in the air at that time. And in fact, Blue Book came to the conclusion that there were extraterrestrial craft and that we were being visited. The people that spent the months looking at the cases came to that conclusion. But when they presented it to a scientific panel who had 2 days with the information and were physicists, and the head of the panel was working for the CIA, I mean, there's a lot of complications. They were not willing to buy the Blue Book conclusions that this was extraterrestrial in origin.
When we come back, I want to talk about why you believe that these were extraterrestrial rather than, let's say, military experimental aircraft or something like that, and also talk about incidents that happened with the missiles, nuclear warhead missiles at Malmstrom.
Okay.
We'll be back with our guest, Joan Bird, after the break. Our guest today is scientist and ufologist Joan Bird, who has written a book called Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials. And Joan, you have a large part of your book that's devoted to incidents that happened at Malmstrom Air Force Base and the missile locations up there.
Yes.
In which there were alleged UFO sightings and a disabling of certain wings of these missiles.
That's correct.
Can you briefly recount what that's about?
Well, the witnesses that began talking about what happened in Montana were some of the first to come to the surface, but there are now over 20 witnesses that have verified this kind of activity in Montana and in other air bases, both in this country and also in Russia, where there were UFOs that were physically sighted and sometimes on radar tracings as well, that were in the vicinity, sometimes hovering over nuclear missile silos or next to them, or the launch control facilities, which are different from the silos themselves, when these missiles were deactivated. So there's just a growing number of witnesses. One of the things that's happening now is so many military witnesses are coming forward and talking about these things, kind of end of life, sometimes deathbed confessions. They just don't want to die without this information being released.
When did these happen at Malmstrom?
In Malmstrom, it was in 1967, I believe.
Well, there were actually a couple. There was one in the 60s, and then there was another one in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, in 75, there were more sightings and more deactivations in the missile bases. 67 was the first one that we had a witness that was willing to come forward and talk about. There were also these events in Russia where the missiles were actually put into launch mode and frightened people very badly.
Well, and it was the reverse, according to your book, that happened here in the U.S., that the missiles were disabled.
Disabled, although there is one witness who says that there was a short launch mode that happened in Minot as well. So there are so many witnesses that come forward, and for people who are skeptics, I just feel like they have to be so cynical, because so many of these witnesses are very highly credentialed, and they know what the Air Force is flying. Some of them are very much aware of the black operations vehicles, the classified vehicles, and those developments as well. And they say, yes, we are building some very unusual craft, but what we saw was not anything that we have or that the Soviets have.
So your assertion here would be that what was happening did not involve U.S. military experimentation or any test aircraft or any sort of vehicles that we might have been using at that time.
No, certainly not in the missile shutdowns.
Okay.
Certainly not in the missile shutdowns. I think that in today's world, that a lot of what people are seeing may be some of our classified craft. Again, things are getting more complicated. But the fact that there are so many of these witnesses out there who are knowledgeable and who do understand those differences, and there are people within the aircraft industry who have been willing to talk about what the developments have. So we have enough information, I think, to make that judgment.
Well, I think that you point out in your book that Boeing actually investigated
Yes.
the incident at Malmstrom, but
Yes.
they were kind of held off, according to your account?
Yes, they were asked to do a report on why there was this malfunction because they didn't understand it. They didn't understand what had happened there. And then when they were in the process of writing up the report, in which they came to the conclusion, well, we don't understand either, we don't know what happened, they were told, forget the report. We don't need it. And that had never happened to them before.
All right, again, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with you with more questions after the break. Our guest today is Joan Bird, and we're talking about her book, Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials. Joan is a trained scientist and has spent a number of years studying UFOs, and A, you believe they do exist, and B, that there is in many, if not all cases, an extraterrestrial connection.
Yes, I do.
But you also assert in your book repeatedly that efforts to investigate this have been, I guess the polite term is obfuscated or blunted by government authorities.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is going on here? Why? Why would that be the case?
Well, it's probably the case also that what was going on in 1950 and the early 50s is different from what's going on now. I think that we may be in the process of slow disclosure at this point in time. But back in the 50s, okay, we had the beginning of the Cold War, and we had the nuclear threat, and there was a lot of fear out there, and we didn't know exactly what the Soviets had. So there was a need to dampen the public's enthusiasm, because I think that there were a lot of craft showing up. I think this may have been in response to the beginning of the use of atomic weapons on the planet. That's what a lot of people in ufology feel, that was an initiation point at which we got the attention of a lot of other civilized places in the galaxy, at least, if not beyond. So in those days, what they did was they initiated a program, really, to try to convince people that everything could be explained. And they hired scientists, and they hired media people, and they hired celebrities. They also hired psychologists, and one of the things that they did was really implement a policy of ridicule or questioning of people who are witnesses. They questioned their intelligence, they questioned their integrity, they questioned their mental stability, sometimes in subtle ways, and they would ridicule them subtly. And we are such a social species, we are so sensitive to ridicule that I believe that that program has still affected the populace as a whole and is still being sustained to some extent. Although there's so much happening. In the paper this morning, there was this planet that they're talking about in the Goldilocks zone. And, you know, in the last 10 years, we've learned that there are, 200 planets out there, not to mention the moons that might be going around those planets that could also support life. I think there are these vectors that are impinging on us that's going to make it very hard for us to keep the lid on it very much longer.
There's another issue going on here that we need to discuss in the brief time we have remaining. Since there are, in this whole field, there are some poseurs, some people who are trying to gain publicity for themselves,
Yes.
and who may not
Yes.
have authentic stories.
Yes, there are hoaxers.
What is the average person to make of this? How are they to sort their way through this?
It's confusing. It's very confusing. And I'm always very careful about jumping to conclusions on things because there are so many hoaxers out there and people wanting attention or wanting to show off their skills in photoshopping or whatever. And we had a hoaxer right here in Helena, this high school student on the eve of the Vigilante Parade. But he had heard about this other landing that had happened that was broadcast on KOMA radio, and so he wanted to copy it. Yeah, that's part of the deal. It's an exercise in discernment.
And using critical thinking.
Yes, and a lot of reading. But there's so much material out there. It's a huge literature.
Unfortunately, at this point, we're going to have to draw it to a close. I want to thank you very much, and we'll be back with some closing thoughts after the break. Presented the views of a scientist who investigated reports that she had encountered upon UFOs and initially felt skepticism about their truth. Ultimately, Joan Bird became a believer in both UFOs and extraterrestrial beings. Now, her book, Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials, addresses far more issues and data than we've been able to cover in the course of this program. If you have an interest in this field, pro or con, it's as good a starting point as any other that I can suggest. I want to thank Joan Bird, and of course you, our viewers. We'd like to hear your thoughts about this weekly broadcast, and we invite you to join us again next week when we have another Montana newsmaker as our guest here. Until then, good luck and Godspeed. Some other scientists tended to dismiss the sightings as other aerial phenomena, such as weather balloons, birds, or aircraft reflections. But the persistence of some evidence, a Montana film in particular, has kept the issue alive. Joan Bird, who now lives in Helena, has written a book about the Montana UFOs and extraterrestrials. I'll get that word out, yeah, right. And this, you've got a copy of the book there. I've got a copy of the book that we've read. Mm-hmm. And this was published just last year.
Yes, about a year.
What brought you, well, let me start this question this way. Do you believe that unidentified flying objects exist? And do you believe that there's an extraterrestrial connection?
I do. I've become convinced in the hours that I've spent in reading the literature and primarily by witness accounts.
How about hard phenomena or hard evidence?
There is quite a bit out there. There's a fair amount of physical evidence. And again, if you look into the literature, you can find it.
The Dunwell Report, featuring top Montana newsmakers, discussing the issues that affect the Treasure State. From Montana State Capitol, here is your moderator, Don Dunwell.
Shortly after the Second World War, the U.S. reported a flurry of aerial phenomena that came to be described as flying saucers. Later, government investigators and others called them unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Now, despite the frequency of the sightings, the U.S. Air Force, which was charged with investigating the reports, along with
evolutionary biology and scientific research.
And I think you come from a family of people who have a vested interest in science as a discipline.
Yes, my brother is a career astrophysicist and my father was an aeronautical engineer, so I have some of that in my heritage.
We'll get a little bit later on what their thoughts or opinions might be about your study of ufology, as the field is, I believe it's called right now. Am I correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
All right.
Way to pronounce it.
What?
There I go now. A little more.
Before we get into the book and some of the issues that are in it, let's talk about your background for a minute. You are not just someone who just walked in off the street or from the bus stop. You've been trained as a scientist. Am I correct?
Yes. In fact, that's why I came to Montana in the first place, was to attend the University of Montana graduate school in zoology.
And you got a doctor's degree there, I believe?
That's right. I worked on inter-island variation in lesser Antillean bullfinches and was really steeped in